The assignment arrived on a Thursday. Ambassador Reth Vaun read it once. Then he read it again. He acknowledged it within 6 hours and spent the remaining time before departure doing what he always did before a new posting. He studied. 29 years. That was how long Reth had been a diplomat. 7 postings across 6 different civilizations. In that time he had developed a methodology for encountering the unfamiliar. He studied the documentation. He familiarized himself with the cultural frameworks. He prepared his research journal. He arrived ready. This had always been sufficient. The methodology had never failed him. He believed it would not fail him now. The Sorvathi Diplomatic Corps had been observing humanity for 60 years. The documentation they had produced was thorough, comprehensive, organized into categorical frameworks that covered human biology, social structure, linguistic patterns, cultural production, technological development, and conflict behavior. It was the kind of documentation that the Corps produced for all of its subject species. Precise, reliable, complete. Reth had read most of it during the transit to Earth. He had taken careful notes. He had organized his research journal into the standard observation categories before the transport entered the final approach corridor. He was, by every measure his training recognized, prepared. He was wrong. He understood this approximately 4 hours after his arrival at the Okafor family home in Lagos, on a Tuesday evening in early September when the air outside was warm and humid and carried smells he did not yet have names for, and the house in front of him was making sounds that his briefing documents had not mentioned, and the woman at the door had flour on her hands and was smiling at him in a way that his documentation had covered mechanically and had not covered at all. The house was full. Not full of people, though there were 4 Okafors present and a neighbor from 2 houses down who had apparently invited herself and whom Adiz Okafor addressed with the specific warmth of someone who had accepted long ago that this was simply how their relationship worked. Full in a different sense entirely. Full of things. Objects accumulated across years of living that covered every surface with the comfortable density of a family that had never prioritized minimalism over use. Books on the side table with other books stacked on top of them. A child's drawing fixed to the refrigerator with 4 separate adhesive pieces when one would have been sufficient. Shoes near the door arranged in the approximate vicinity of a line. Plants on the windowsill, 3 of them, 1 healthy, 1 recovering, 1 that appeared to have given up but that no one had removed because giving up had not yet been officially acknowledged. Full of sound. Marcus was on his communication device in the kitchen, his voice carrying through the house with the particular ease of someone who had never learned to speak quietly in a space he owned. Chisholm was producing music from her room upstairs at a volume that suggested she had not been informed the ambassador was arriving this evening. Emeka was on the living room floor engaged in a construction project of unclear purpose that required all of his attention and none of his silence. He was narrating the project to himself in a continuous low murmur that paused only when something required his full concentration, at which point the silence was brief and the narration resumed. Full of smell. Adiz was cooking something. Retha's biosensors categorized it as complex organic compounds derived from multiple botanical and protein sources combined through sustained thermal application. His less scientific faculties categorized it as something that made the house feel like a place where you were expected. Adiz came to the door. She had flour on her hands. She apologized for the flour on her hands. She said she had been in the middle of something and lost track of the time, which was the first thing she said to him and which turned out to be a reliable introduction to who she was. She was tall. Close-cropped hair. She had the quality of presence that Reth would later spend considerable time trying to document accurately and that resisted precise documentation. The best he managed, in his personal journal 3 weeks into his posting, was this: she has the ability to make a space feel simultaneously larger and more inhabited than it was before she entered it. He read this back and knew it was accurate and insufficient simultaneously, which was a feeling he would become familiar with over the course of the year. She said, "Ambassador Vaun. Welcome. I am sorry about the noise. Chisholm does not know you are here yet. Emeka knows but has decided his building project is more important than coming to say hello. That is actually a compliment. He only ignores things he is comfortable with. Reth said, I appreciate the context. Adi smiled. It was the first genuine human smile directed at him outside a diplomatic setting. His documentation had covered the mechanics of human smiling in considerable detail. The muscular engagement, the social signaling function, the cultural variations in application and interpretation. None of this documentation had covered what it felt like to be on the receiving end of one. At close range. In a warm house. From someone with flour on their hands who had just explained that her 7-year-old ignoring him was a sign of acceptance. Reth filed this gap in his documentation for later attention. Marcus emerged from the kitchen. He was a large man. Reading glasses pushed up on his forehead in the way of someone who had put them there temporarily and would spend the next several hours wondering where they were. He was still holding his communication device. He moved through the house with the particular ease of someone who had occupied a space long enough that navigation required no attention. He shook Retha's hand in the human manner. Reth had practiced this. Marcus said, "We are very glad you are here. I have so many questions. I am going to try very hard not to ask all of them tonight." From the floor of the living room, without looking up from his construction project, Emeka said, "I have questions too." Marcus said, Emeka. Emeka said, "I am just saying I also have questions." Marcus said, to Reth, "That is Emeka." Reth looked at the 7-year-old human on the floor. Emeka looked up at him. The assessment was complete and unguarded in the way of a child who had not yet learned to moderate curiosity for social comfort. He looked at Reth the way he might look at anything new and interesting. Directly. Without apology. Without the layered social calculation that adults applied to first encounters. Emeka said, "You are taller than I thought." Reth said, "I am told this frequently." Emeka considered this information. He appeared to find it satisfactory. He returned to his construction project. The matter was settled. Chisholm appeared at the top of the stairs. She had clearly just become aware that someone was in her house. She looked down at Reth from the top of the staircase with the expression of a 14-year-old who had decided that being impressed by things was not currently consistent with her identity. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Hi." Then she went back to her room. The music resumed at its previous volume. Adi said, "That was Chisholm. She will warm up." Marcus said, "She is already curious. She just needs you to not notice." That evening Reth sat in the small room the Okafors had given him. It was a bedroom that had previously belonged to no one in particular. It had been furnished with the combination of practical consideration and warm imprecision that characterized the Okafor approach to most things. A bed. A desk. A lamp. A small plant on the windowsill that appeared to be in better health than the ones downstairs, which suggested it had been placed there recently and specifically. He opened his research journal and wrote his first official entry. He wrote, "The Okafor family does not behave according to the documented behavioral patterns for formal first contact situations. This is likely because they do not consider this a formal first contact situation. This distinction requires further analysis." He stopped. He looked at the sentence. Then he opened a second notebook. A personal one. He had not planned to keep a personal journal. He kept one anyway. He wrote, "The youngest family member assessed me directly and without social mediation. He told me I was taller than he expected and accepted my response and returned to his project. I found this more comfortable than any formal diplomatic greeting I have received in 29 years. I do not have an adequate framework for why." He closed both journals. He sat and listened to the sounds of the house settling into its evening. Footsteps on the stairs. A door. The music from Chisholm's room dropping to a lower volume, which he would later understand was her form of acknowledgement. The sound of Marcus and Adi speaking in the kitchen. Not the words. The rhythm of it. Two people who had been talking to each other for a long time and had developed a specific music of their own. He sat and listened until the house went quiet. Then he went to sleep. The first 2 weeks were observational in the purest sense. Reth moved through the Okafor household with the careful attentiveness of a researcher who understood that the first period in any new environment was the most important. Patterns established early. Assumptions formed quickly. The quality of observation in the first 2 weeks would shape the quality of the entire year's documentation. He watched the mornings first. The Okafor morning was not a single event. It was a layered sequence of overlapping individual events that occupied the same spaces at approximately the same times but that each followed their own internal logic. Marcus rose first. He made coffee with the focused attention of someone for whom this was the most important task of the morning and who was not yet awake enough to apply that attention to anything more complex. He drank it standing at the kitchen counter, reading something on his communication device, occasionally making a sound that indicated either interest or disagreement. It was not always clear which. Adiz rose 20 minutes later. She moved through the morning with the efficiency of someone who had performed this sequence thousands of times and had reduced it to its essential components. She did not waste motion. She did not require silence. She did not require conversation. She occupied the kitchen alongside Marcus with the comfortable economy of two people who had long ago negotiated the terms of shared morning space. Emeka appeared when he appeared. There was no predicting it. Some mornings he arrived in the kitchen before Adiz. Some mornings he needed to be called twice. Some mornings he arrived already fully engaged in a thought that had apparently begun before he left his room and that he picked up mid-sentence as if the conversation had been ongoing. Chisholm descended the stairs at the last possible moment. Every morning, without exception, she appeared when departure was imminent. She consumed whatever was available with the speed of someone who had calculated exactly how much time eating required and allocated precisely that amount and not one moment more. She said goodbye in the specific way of a teenager who was simultaneously present and already elsewhere. Then she was gone. Reth documented all of this. He documented the meals. The Okafors ate together when they could and adjusted without apparent distress when they could not. The meals were loud. Everyone spoke. Topics changed without transition. Marcus might be mid-sentence about a historical event when Emeka interrupted with a question about the construction project and Adiz responded to something Chisholm had said 3 exchanges earlier, and the conversation accommodated all of this simultaneously without losing any thread entirely. Reth had eaten at diplomatic tables across 6 civilizations. He had never eaten at a table like the Okafor table. He had never been at a meal where the conversation moved this way. Fast and overlapping and entirely without the structured turn-taking that every diplomatic protocol he had ever studied treated as the foundation of civilized discourse. He found it, to his own surprise, not chaotic. He found it alive. He began keeping his 2 journals with increasing regularity. The official journal documented what he observed. The personal journal documented what he experienced. The distance between these 2 categories was becoming apparent. They were not the same thing. They had never been the same thing in 29 years of posting, but he had never previously maintained a separate record for the distinction. He was not entirely certain why he was maintaining one now. He wrote in his personal journal, at the end of the 2nd week, "I have begun to learn the specific sounds this house makes. I know the difference between the sound of Emeka descending the stairs and the sound of Chisholm descending the stairs. I know the sound Marcus makes when something he is reading surprises him. I know the particular rhythm of Adiz moving through the kitchen when she is cooking something that requires attention versus something she can make without thinking. I did not intend to learn these things. I learned them anyway. I am noting this because I believe it is relevant. I am not yet certain to what." On a Saturday morning in the 4th week, Emeka appeared in the doorway of Retha's room. He knocked first. 1 knock. Then he stood in the doorway and waited. He did not come in without being invited. This was, Reth had observed, a rule he applied consistently and that no one had explicitly taught him, which meant he had derived it from observation and applied it independently. Reth found this worth noting. He said, "Yes." Emeka said, "Can I show you something?" Reth set down his work. He said, "Yes." Emeka led him through the house and out the back door into the small yard. It was a cool October morning. The sky was the particular grey of early autumn in this part of the world. Marcus's vegetable garden occupied most of the yard space. It was tended with the optimism of someone whose ambition exceeded his productivity and whose enjoyment of the activity was entirely independent of the harvest. There were several plants in varying states of health. There were also two that appeared to have concluded their productive period and that Marcus had not yet acknowledged as finished. Emeka took him to a corner of the garden. A specific patch of soil, clearly demarcated from the surrounding area by careful attention. Something small and green was growing there. Healthy. Upright. Emeka said, "I planted this. It is a tomato plant. Dad helped me with the soil at the beginning, but mostly I did it." Reth looked at the plant carefully. He said, "It appears healthy." Emeka said, "It is going to be really big. Dad says tomatoes take a while, but they are worth it." Reth said, "How long have you been tending it?" Emeka said, "Since July. So almost 4 months now." Reth calculated. He said, "You have been caring for it for 4 months without visible fruit." Emeka looked at him. It was a specific look. The look of someone who had encountered a perspective they found genuinely puzzling. Not offensive. Not wrong exactly. Just missing something that seemed obvious. He said, "It is growing. That is not nothing. That is a result." Reth looked at the plant again. Small. Green. Healthy. The product of 4 months of daily attention from a 7-year-old who came to check on it every morning before anything else. Who watered it and monitored it and reported on its progress at dinner with the seriousness appropriate to something that mattered. Who did not experience the absence of fruit as the absence of progress. Reth said, "You are correct. I misstated it." Emeka accepted this. He crouched down next to the plant and checked its soil with 2 fingers the way Marcus had shown him. He nodded to himself. Satisfied. He said, "You can come and look at it whenever you want. I check it every morning, but you can look any time." Reth said, "Thank you." Emeka stood up. He looked at Reth with the direct, uncomplicated assessment that Reth had come to recognize as his default mode of engagement. He said, "Do you have plants where you are from?" Reth said, "We have living things that serve similar biological functions. They are different in their form." Emeka considered this. He said, "Do you miss them?" Reth considered the question carefully. He said, "I have not thought about it." Emeka said, "Maybe you should think about it." Then he went back inside. Reth stood in the backyard for a while longer. He looked at the tomato plant. He looked at Marcus's garden with its optimistic arrangements and its variable outcomes. He looked at the yard itself, small and enclosed and full of the evidence of a family that used its outdoor space the way it used all of its spaces, completely and without excessive concern for appearance. That evening he wrote in his personal journal, "The youngest family member has been tending a plant for 4 months with daily consistency. He does not experience the absence of visible result as the absence of progress. He understands growth as its own form of result. He invited me to observe the plant whenever I wished. He asked me if I missed the living things from my home. I told him I had not thought about it. This was accurate. I am thinking about it now." He paused. Then he wrote, "I am not certain what I miss. I am not certain this is the correct question. The youngest family member suggested I think about it. I believe he was right." 6 weeks into his posting, Chisholm knocked on the doorframe of the small sitting room. 1 knock. Then she stood in the doorway. She did not come in. She had the posture of someone who had not fully committed to being there. Who had arrived at a decision and was still reviewing it. Reth was reviewing core communications. He looked up. She said, "I am reading something. For school, but also because I want to. It is a series. I have opinions about it, and everyone in this house either has not read it or tells me what to think about it, which is different from wanting to know what I think." A pause. She said, "You probably do not know it." Reth said, "I probably do not. But I am available if you want to share your opinions." She came in. She sat in the chair across from him. She sat in the way of someone who was simultaneously relaxed and monitoring herself for relaxation, which was a particular quality he had observed in her from the beginning and that he was beginning to understand was not performance but habit. She told him about the series. She had been reading it for 2 years. She had opinions about every book and most of the chapters and several specific scenes that she had returned to multiple times and that she had analyzed with a precision that most adult researchers would recognize as genuine critical thinking. Her opinions were specific. Argued. She held them with confidence and revised them immediately when he offered a counter-perspective she had not considered. This last quality was the most significant. She did not defend her positions past the point of evidence. She genuinely wanted to understand the thing she was thinking about, not to be confirmed in what she already thought. Reth offered several perspectives she had not considered. She considered each one seriously. She accepted 2. She rejected one with a counter-argument that was better than his original point. She held the 4th in reserve, she said, because she needed to reread a specific chapter before she decided. They talked for 2 hours. At the end she stood to leave. She was almost at the door when she stopped. She did not turn around fully. She said it to the door frame. She said, "You are the only person in this house who does not tell me what I should think about things." Reth said, "Your thinking is already good. It does not require direction." Chisholm was quiet for a moment. She said, "You are surprisingly not annoying." She left. Reth sat in the sitting room for a while after she had gone. In his official journal he wrote, "Subject for demonstrates advanced critical reasoning and genuine intellectual flexibility. She revises her positions in response to adequate evidence without social discomfort. This is a relatively uncommon combination." Noting for the cultural analysis section. In his personal journal he wrote, "Chisholm paid me the highest unsolicited compliment she has offered anyone in the 6 weeks I have been here. I know this because I have been watching. I valued it more than I expected to. I am recording this because I believe the gap between what I expected to feel and what I actually felt is itself a data point. I am not yet certain what it is data for." He closed both journals. He looked at the wall of the small sitting room for a while. He thought about Emeka asking him if he missed the living things from home. He thought about the way Adi's smile had arrived at the door on the first evening and what it had done to the documentation he had been preparing to apply to the situation. He thought about Marcus at the kitchen table explaining that the only person who knows whether you did the thing properly is you. He had been at this posting for 6 weeks. He had filled more pages of his personal journal than he had filled in 6 years of previous postings combined. He was not certain what this meant. He was beginning to suspect it meant something important. Winter arrived and the Okafor house responded to it the way it responded to most things. By becoming more itself. The windows fogged in the mornings. The kitchen became the gravitational center of the house in a way that it was not during the warmer months, pulling everyone toward it in the evenings with the specific logic of warmth and light and the smell of whatever Adiz was making on the stove. Marcus moved his grading from his study to the kitchen table. He said it was because the kitchen was warmer. This was true and also incomplete. The kitchen was where everyone was. Marcus, Reth had come to understand, did not like to be in rooms alone when the alternative was available. Emeka's construction projects grew more ambitious. He had completed 3 since Reth's arrival. Each one larger than the last. Each one explained to Reth in considerable detail at various stages of completion. The current project was the largest yet and Emeka had declined to reveal its nature until it was finished, which he said would be before Christmas, which was a human observance that the house was beginning to prepare for in ways that Reth found both comprehensible from his documentation and entirely different from what the documentation had led him to expect. The documentation had described Christmas as a cultural and in many cases religious observance centered on gift exchange and family gathering. This was accurate. It had not described the particular texture of a house preparing for it. The boxes brought down from storage and opened with the specific pleasure of things retrieved after a year. The decorations that each had a history. Adiz unwrapping a ceramic figure and saying that Chisholm had made this in the 3rd year of primary school and Chisholm saying it was terrible and Adiz saying it was perfect and both of them being entirely sincere. Emeka distributing decorations across the house with a logic that was clear to him and that he explained carefully, and that still resulted in arrangements that Marcus quietly redistributed after Emeka was in bed, which Emeka either did not notice or chose not to address. Reth watched all of this. He documented it in his official journal under Cultural Observance Practices, Winter Period. In his personal journal he wrote something different. He wrote, "There is a ceramic figure on the windowsill of the main sitting room that Chisholm made when she was 7 years old. It is, by any objective measure, not well made. The proportions are uncertain. The glaze is uneven. It depicts something that might be an animal or might be a person or might be neither. Adiz placed it in the most visible position on the windowsill. Chisholm said it was terrible. Adiz said it was perfect. I have been looking at it for 3 days. I think they are both correct. I think this is not a contradiction." He paused. Then he added, "I do not have a category in my official documentation for things that are terrible and perfect simultaneously. I am beginning to think this is a gap in the documentation rather than a gap in the things." The moment came on a Wednesday night in January. Reth had been in his room reviewing core communications since the evening. The house had gone quiet at its usual hour. Marcus into his study. Adiz to bed after a long shift. Emeka asleep by 8:30 with his characteristic completeness, the way children sleep when sleep is still something that arrives without negotiation. Chisholm's light had been visible under her door until 11. Then dark. At 2 in the morning Reth became aware that Marcus's study light was still on. He noticed this because he had learned the light patterns of the house the way he had learned its sounds. He knew which lights were on at which hours. He knew what their presence or absence indicated about the state of the people attached to them. Marcus's study light being on at 2 in the morning was not part of any pattern Reth had established in 4 months of observation. He noted it and returned to his work. At 2:30 he went to the kitchen for water. The study door was open. Marcus was inside, surrounded by papers. His reading glasses were on his face, which meant he had found them, which meant the work was serious enough to require them. He was writing something by hand on a physical document, which Reth had observed him do only when he considered the task important enough to warrant the slower and more deliberate process of handwriting over typing. His posture was the posture of someone in the middle of something they had decided to finish. Reth stopped in the hallway. Marcus looked up. He said, "Sorry. Did I wake you?" Reth said, "No. I required water." "What are you working on?" Marcus leaned back in his chair. He looked at the papers around him with the expression of someone who had been inside a problem long enough to have forgotten there was an outside. He said, "Lesson plan. I have been teaching the same unit on the transatlantic slave trade for 6 years." A pause. He said, "I realize today that I have been doing it wrong. Not factually wrong. But not right either. Not well enough. There is a difference between teaching something accurately and teaching it in a way that actually reaches the people in the room. I have been doing the first one." Reth said, "And the second one requires this." Marcus said, "The second one requires that I actually think about who is sitting in front of me and what they need from this material and how to give it to them in a way that they will carry with them after they leave my classroom. That takes longer than the first one." Reth said, "Your students will not know you did this." Marcus said, "No." A pause. Reth said, "They will experience the result but they will not know the cause." Marcus said, "Right." He picked up his pen. He looked at the document in front of him. He said, "Most of the time the only person who knows whether you did the thing properly is you. You know when you took the easy version. You know when you did not. That knowledge lives with you. Not with the people who received the result." He paused. "That has to be enough. Knowing you did it right has to be enough even when no one else knows. Otherwise you end up doing the easy version every time no one is watching. And eventually that becomes the only version you know how to do." Reth stood in the hallway with his glass of water. He said, "That is a standard that is entirely self-enforced." Marcus said, "Yes." Reth said, "There is no external mechanism that requires it." Marcus said, "No." Reth said, "You apply it anyway." Marcus looked at him. He said, "I try to." He returned to his document. Reth went back to his room. He set his water down on the desk. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. He did not open his official journal. He opened his personal journal and he wrote for a long time. He wrote, "Marcus Okafor is rewriting a professional document at 2 in the morning. The audience for this document is a group of adolescent humans who will have no awareness that a revision occurred. They will receive a lesson that is better than the one they would have received. They will not know it is better because they will have no reference point for the version that was not written." He stopped. He wrote, "The motivation for this work is entirely internal. There is no external evaluation. No professional review. No recognition. The standard being applied is self-generated and self-enforced. The beneficiaries are unaware of it." He stopped again. He sat with the next thought for a long time before he wrote it. He wrote, "I have documented similar behavior in Sorvathi diplomatic contexts. Senior diplomats maintaining standards beyond what is required. Beyond what is observed. Beyond what would be penalized if left undone. I have documented this and categorized it under professional excellence and moved on." He looked at that sentence. Then he wrote, "I do not think professional excellence is the right category. I think I have been using that category because I did not have a better one. I think the better category is something like the decision to be worth the trust of people who depend on you, even when those people cannot see whether you are making that decision or not." He underlined the last sentence. Then he wrote, "Marcus Okafor is at his desk at 2 in the morning being worth the trust of people who do not know he is doing it. I do not have a category for this in my official documentation. I think the official documentation has a gap." He closed the journal. He sat in the quiet of his room and listened to the faint sound of Marcus's pen moving across paper in the study down the hall. He sat there for a long time. He filed his 6-month report in March. 12 pages. Formatted correctly. Organized into the standard core categories. Every observation accurate. Every behavioral pattern documented with the precision his training had established as his professional standard. He reviewed it twice before transmission. He found no errors. He transmitted it. That evening he sat in his room and read it again. He read it the way he rarely read his own work. Slowly. From the beginning. Treating it as a document produced by someone else. The report was correct. He was certain of that. Every sentence in it was accurate. The documentation was exactly what a 6-month core immersion report was supposed to be. He had done his job properly. The review committee would receive it and find nothing to question and file it in the Humanity Program archive alongside the reports of his predecessors, and it would be exactly what it was supposed to be. He read it a third time. And sitting in his room on a quiet March evening with the report on his screen and the sounds of the Okafor house around him, he understood something with the particular clarity of a realization that has been assembling itself for months without permission. The report was accurate. It was also the most incomplete accurate document he had ever produced. It contained everything he had observed. It contained nothing he had experienced. And the distance between those two categories had been growing since the first evening when Adiz had smiled at him at the door with flour on her hands, and it was now large enough that he could not look at 12 pages of correct documentation without feeling the size of what they did not contain. He opened his personal journal. He wrote, "The 6-month report does not contain the following things." He wrote, "It does not contain the specific way Marcus laughs at his own jokes before he has finished telling them, which creates a rhythm that is entirely his own and that I have come to recognize from 3 rooms away." He wrote, "It does not contain the fact that Adiz hums when she is not aware she is doing it. Fragments of songs. The same fragments repeated in varying order. I have begun to recognize them. I know which fragment she reaches for when she is tired and which one appears when she is in the particular mood that precedes her best cooking." He wrote, "It does not contain Chisholm's habit of leaving her books face down when she sets them aside. She cannot bear to lose her place even for a moment. Even for 10 minutes. The book stays open and face down on whatever surface is nearest. This is not about the book. It is about the quality of her attention to things she values. She does not want to lose her place in anything she has decided matters. He wrote, it does not contain Emeka checking his tomato plant every morning before anything else. Before breakfast. Before conversation. He goes to the backyard first. He checks the soil. He checks the leaves. He checks the stake he put in to support the stem when the plant grew tall enough to need it. He does this in winter when there is nothing to check and nothing to find, because caring for something does not pause because the thing is not actively producing. He stopped writing. He looked at what he had written. He added one more line, I have not thought of myself as a researcher living with a family for some weeks now. I do not know precisely when this changed. I know it has changed. I am noting it here because I believe it is the most significant finding of the first 6 months, and it does not appear anywhere in the 12 pages I transmitted this evening. He closed the journal. He did not sleep well that night. The dedicated conversation happened on a Sunday in February. Adiz had a full day off. This was not common. Her schedule was demanding and her days off were frequently interrupted or reduced. A full day was something she used deliberately. She spent the morning cooking. Not a quick meal. Something long. Something that required multiple stages and sustained attention and the particular focused pleasure of a person doing the thing they do best in the time they have chosen to do it. Reth was at the kitchen table reviewing documentation when she began. He offered to move. She said there was no need. She said she found it easier to cook when someone was in the room. She said cooking alone was fine, but cooking with someone nearby was better, even if the someone was reading and not paying attention, because the presence of another person changed the quality of the silence. Reth said he had not considered that silences had qualities. Adiz said all silences had qualities. She said the silence of an empty house was different from the silence of a house where everyone was asleep, and different again from the silence of a room where someone was present but occupied with their own work. She said the third kind was the most comfortable. Reth said, which is what this is. Adiz said, which is what this is. He continued his reading. She continued her cooking. They occupied the kitchen together in the third kind of silence for a while. Then she said, without turning from the stove, can I ask you something? Reth said, yes. She said, what made you apply for this posting? Living with a family. It is not the usual diplomatic assignment. Reth said, the Corps assigned it. I did not apply. Adiz said, but you could have declined. Reth considered this. He said, I could have. She turned from the stove. She looked at him with the direct attention she brought to things that mattered to her. She said, why did you not decline? Reth said, because my methodology has always been to study the documentation and arrive prepared. And the documentation on human domestic life was the least complete documentation in the humanity file. I recognized the gap. I thought closing it was worthwhile. Adiz looked at him for a moment. She said, and now? Reth said, now I think the gap was not in the documentation. I think the gap was in the methodology. Adiz smiled. She turned back to the stove. After a moment she said, I became a nurse because I wanted to help people. That is the simple answer. The longer answer is that I became a nurse because I wanted to be in the room when things mattered. Most of life happens at a distance from the moments that actually count. Nursing puts you in the room. Reth said, at significant personal cost. Adiz said, yes. She stirred something. The smell in the kitchen deepened. She said, there are days that take everything. You give everything the shift requires and you drive home and you think there is nothing left. And then you walk in the door and Emeka is at the kitchen table with his homework and he needs help with one problem and you sit down and help him. And something comes from somewhere that you did not think was there. A pause. She said, I used to think that was willpower. Or duty. Now I think it is something else. I think the people you love make you capable of more than you contain on your own. I think love is not just a feeling. I think it is a resource. One that regenerates when you use it in the right direction. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of cooking. Reth said, I have not encountered that formulation in any documentation I have reviewed. Adiz said, no. I do not think it translates into documentation very well. She plated something and set it in front of him. She said, "Tell me what you think." He ate it. He thought about it carefully in the way he thought about things that deserved attention. He said, "This is the best thing I have eaten since I arrived on Earth." Adi said, "Good. There is more." That evening Reth wrote in his personal journal, Adi's Okafor described love as a resource that regenerates when used in the right direction. She said this without apparent awareness that it was one of the most precisely observed things anyone has said to me in 29 years of diplomatic work. I am recording it here because I want to remember that I heard it in a kitchen on a Sunday afternoon while she was cooking and I was reading, and neither of us was performing anything for any audience. Marcus came home from a medical appointment on a Thursday afternoon in April. Reth heard the door. He heard the particular quality of the silence that followed it. In 7 months he had learned the sounds of Marcus entering the house. The door. The keys. The specific sequence of movements that constituted Marcus arriving home. He knew the sound of a good day and the sound of a difficult one and the sound of a day that had been unremarkable and that Marcus was already mentally leaving behind in favor of the evening ahead. This sound was none of those. This was stillness where movement should have been. Adi's came from the kitchen. Reth heard her footsteps stop. He heard the quality of the silence between them in the hallway. He was in his room and he did not try to hear their words. He heard only the silence and understood from its texture that something had shifted. The family gathered at the kitchen table that evening. Reth was included. He had been included in family meals for 7 months and the inclusion had long since stopped feeling like an accommodation. But tonight was different from dinner. Marcus had asked them all to come to the table and there was nothing on it except themselves. Marcus spoke with the directness of someone who had made a clear decision about how to do this. He said he had received a diagnosis. He said it was serious. He said the treatment would be demanding and the timeline was uncertain, and he was telling them now, all of them at once, because he did not believe in managing information that affected everyone. He said he needed them to know what was true so that they could face it together with accurate information rather than with the version that had been softened into something less frightening and therefore less real. He said, "I am telling you because you are my family and I trust you with the truth." He looked at each of them. He looked last at Reth. He said, "All of you." The kitchen was completely quiet. Chisholm sat very still. She sat still for a long time. Long enough that the stillness became its own kind of statement. Then she stood up from her chair. She went upstairs. Reth heard her door close. He heard the silence of her room, which was different from her usual silence, which had music or movement in it. Then he heard the door open. She came back down the stairs. She came back to the table. She sat in her chair. She reached across the table and placed her hand over her father's hand. She did not say anything. She did not look up. She simply put her hand there and left it there. It was the most purely communicative thing Reth had ever observed her do. In 7 months of watching Chisholm Okafor navigate a world she was still learning to be in, he had seen her be funny and sharp and generous and occasionally cruel in the thoughtless way of someone who did not yet fully understand the weight of her own intelligence. He had seen her be brave in the way teenagers are brave, loudly and with significant concern for how the bravery appears. He had seen her be kind in the indirect way she preferred, sideways and deniable. He had never seen her be this. This was not performed. This was not calculated. This was Chisholm Okafor at the exact edge of what she knew how to do, reaching past that edge because her father needed her to. Emeka had been watching his father. He said, "Are you scared?" Marcus said, "A little bit." "Yes." Emeka said, "I will sit next to you if you want." He did not wait for the answer. He picked up his chair and moved it to his father's side and sat down. He was 7 years old and he had understood the word serious without understanding all of its contents, and he had responded to his understanding with the only thing he knew how to offer with certainty. His presence. Marcus put his arm around his son. Reth looked at the kitchen table. At Marcus with his arm around Emeka. At Chisholm with her hand over her father's hand. At Adiz across the table, her face doing several things at once with the practiced containment of someone who was holding herself together for the specific purpose of giving others permission to do otherwise. He wrote nothing in his journal that night. He sat in his room and thought about the structure of the family. He had been documenting it for 7 months. He had been calling it family dynamics and social cohesion patterns and adaptive behavioral frameworks. He understood now that he had been using the wrong words. The right word was not a category from the core documentation. The right word was something that the kitchen table had just demonstrated more clearly than any documentation could contain. The right word was held. They were held. By each other. By something that had been built across years of ordinary evenings and ordinary meals and late nights and early mornings and Emeka's plant and Marcus's lesson plans and Adi's soups and Chisholm's books left face down on every surface. This thing that held them had not been visible until tonight because tonight was the first time it had needed to carry this much weight. But it had been there all along. Reth understood, sitting in his room in the quiet of a house that was managing something enormous, that the ordinary evenings had not been the absence of this structure. They had been its continuous construction. Every meal. Every conversation. Every unremarkable Tuesday. Every 2 in the morning. Every tomato plant checked in the rain. All of it. Construction. And tonight it was holding. The months that followed were the most significant of his posting. He documented them as carefully as he could. He was aware throughout that his documentation was increasingly insufficient to what he was witnessing. He wrote it anyway. Because documentation was what he had. Because writing things down was how he processed them. Because some part of him understood that this year was going to require a record even if the record could not contain everything. The house did not collapse. He had not known what to expect. His documentation on human responses to serious illness within family units described a range of behavioral outcomes. Increased conflict. Withdrawal. Role disruption. Emotional dysregulation. These were the documented patterns. They were real. They happened to real families. He had no reason to expect the Okafors to be exempt from them. But the Okafors did not collapse. They reconfigured. This was the word he used in his personal journal, and it was the most accurate word he found. Not adaptation, which implied adjusting to something external. Not resilience, which implied returning to a previous state. Reconfiguration. The family looked at the new shape of their reality and reorganized themselves around it with the specific practical intelligence of people who understood that the situation required something different from what had been working before and who were willing to provide it. Adiz restructured her schedule. This required conversations with her hospital department that Reth was not present for and that he understood from their outcomes had not been simple. She managed a calendar that had become significantly more complicated. Treatment appointments. Monitoring visits. The particular logistical architecture of serious illness overlaid onto the existing architecture of a family with 2 children and 2 demanding careers. She managed it with professional precision. She did not allow the complication to reach the faces of her children if she could prevent it. This was a choice Reth observed her making repeatedly and deliberately. Not denial. Not pretense. She was not hiding the reality. She was managing her own expression of it for the specific purpose of maintaining a certain quality of stability in the house. She understood that her children could feel the weight of what was happening. She was ensuring they did not also have to carry her weight on top of their own. And she maintained the cooking. Every weekend. Without exception. Through the difficult months and the better months and the months that were neither. The long soups that took most of the day. The meals that required multiple stages and sustained attention. The kitchen full of smell and warmth on Sunday afternoons. Reth asked her about this once. He said, "You maintain the cooking even on the hardest weekends?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" She looked at him with the expression of someone who had not previously articulated something they had always known. She said, "Because the soup is always there. Whatever else is not there. The soup is. And I need there to be something in this house that is always there." She returned to the stove. Reth wrote in his personal journal, Adese Okafor maintains a domestic ritual under conditions that would justify abandoning it. The ritual is not maintained for herself. It is maintained as a form of constancy for the people around her. She has converted an act of cooking into an act of structural support. The soup is the signal that the house is still the house. I do not know how to put this in the official documentation. I do not know what category it belongs to. I know it belongs somewhere important. Chisholm changed. Not suddenly. Not in any single moment that Reth could point to and say, this is where it happened. Gradually. Through the accumulation of small decisions made over weeks and months that added up to something that was recognizably different from the Chisholm who had stood at the top of the stairs on his first evening and said hi with studied indifference. She came home directly after school. Every day. Without the detours and delays that had characterized her afternoons in the earlier months. She came home and she was present in the house in a way that was different from before. Not louder. Not more talkative. More present. The distinction was subtle and real. She sat in the kitchen while Marcus rested. She did not make conversation. She did not perform the role of attentive daughter in any way that was visible as performance. She simply did her homework at the kitchen table instead of in her room. She was there. Available. In the same space. And Marcus, on the afternoons when he had the energy to be in the kitchen rather than resting, would look up from whatever he was doing and see her there, and something in his face would change in a way that Reth observed and could not put into words, but that he was certain was significant. She was giving him something. Not words. Not gestures. Her presence. The specific communication of, I am here. I am not going anywhere. Whatever this is, I am in the same room with you for it. Reth watched this and wrote in his personal journal, Chisholm Okafor has made herself more available to her family over the past 2 months. She has done this without announcement and without apparent expectation of acknowledgement. She is 14 years old and she is learning, in real time and under real conditions, the difference between being present and being nearby. Most adults I have encountered in 29 years of diplomatic work have not fully learned this distinction. She is learning it now. I am watching it happen. Emeka checked his tomato plant every morning. This had not changed. Through the difficult months and the better months and the months that were complicated in ways that 7-year-olds understand differently than adults, Emeka went to the backyard every morning before anything else. The plant had grown. It had grown considerably over the spring. By June it was tall and full and producing with the generous consistency of a plant that had been well tended for nearly a year. There were tomatoes at various stages of ripeness at any given time. Emeka monitored them with the attention of someone tracking a significant project toward its completion. He brought the first ripe one to the dinner table on a Thursday evening in June. He carried it from the kitchen on a small plate. He set it in the middle of the table. He sat down. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone reviewing an achievement that had required a long time and consistent effort and that had arrived exactly as expected and was still somehow surprising. He said, "It is ready." Marcus said, "I see that." Emeka said, "I checked it this morning and it was ready. I waited until dinner so everyone could see it." Adi said, "That was very thoughtful." Emeka said, "I know." Marcus cut the tomato carefully. He distributed it. He ate his piece slowly. With the full attention of someone honoring something that deserved to be honored. Not because the tomato was extraordinary. Because the year that had produced it was. Because a 7-year-old had tended something through 4 seasons and brought it to completion, and that was worth eating slowly. Emeka watched his father eat his piece. He said, "Is it good?" Marcus said, "It is the best tomato I have ever eaten." Emeka said, "I know." Reth ate his piece. It was, by any objective botanical assessment, a standard tomato. Ripe. Properly grown. Competently cultivated. It was also the best tomato he had ever eaten. He did not say this. He did not need to. He sat at the table and ate his piece slowly and understood that the tomato was not the point and was entirely the point, and that these two things were not contradictory. He documented his own behavior for the first time in the 8th month. He had been documenting the family's behavior since September. His official journal contained thousands of words of careful observation about every member of the Okafor household. Their patterns and rhythms and individual characteristics and the specific ways they occupied shared space. He had never included himself in this documentation because he was the observer. The observer was not the subject. In the 8th month he understood this was no longer accurate. He was no longer only an observer. He wrote in his personal journal, on a night in May when the house was quiet and the realization had been building for long enough that it finally required acknowledgement, I have been a participant in this household for approximately 4 months. I did not notice the transition because it did not happen in a single moment. It accumulated. Through small decisions I made without fully examining them. I am examining them now. He documented the drives to school. On the mornings when Adiz had early shifts and Marcus was managing a difficult day, Reth drove Emeka to school. This had begun as a practical arrangement and had become something else. The drive was 15 minutes. Emeka used it the way children use enclosed spaces with trusted adults. To say things that had been waiting for the right container. He talked about his plant. He talked about his friends. He talked about things that had happened at school that he was still processing. He talked about his father with the specific honesty of a child who understood that something serious was happening and who needed to say that out loud to someone who would receive it without either dismissing it or making it larger than he could manage. Reth received it. He listened without minimizing and without amplifying. He asked questions when questions were useful. He was quiet when quiet was useful. He learned, over the course of many 15-minute drives, that the most valuable thing he could offer Emeka was his consistent unhurried attention. Not answers. Not reassurance. Attention. He documented the afternoons with Marcus. On the days when Marcus was well enough to be in the backyard and not well enough for the demands of his regular life, they sat together. Sometimes with something to drink. Sometimes with Marcus grading papers at the outdoor table when he had the energy for it. Sometimes with nothing except the backyard and the afternoon and the tomato plant growing steadily in its corner. They talked. Human history, which Marcus knew in a way that was simultaneously academic and personal, as though the events of the past were things that had happened to people he cared about rather than abstractions in a curriculum. Sorvathi political structure, which Marcus found fascinating and asked about with the genuine curiosity of someone who wanted to understand rather than to have understood. The specific satisfaction of teaching. The way a lesson that worked was like a well-constructed argument, built from its foundation, earning its conclusion. They talked about the year. Not directly. Not in a way that named what was happening or tried to contain it in language. But in the way that two people who are both aware of something can talk around the edges of it and communicate what matters without requiring the center to be spoken. Reth understood, across many of those afternoons, that Marcus was doing for him what he had always done for his students. He was teaching. Not a subject. Something harder to name. Something about how to be present in a life that contains difficult things. How to remain interested in the world while the world is also being difficult. How to find the next worthwhile conversation. He documented the evenings with Chisholm. She had come to his room on 3 separate occasions since the Sunday evening of the book conversation. Each time with a different pretext. A question about a historical event she was studying. A perspective she wanted to test on someone who would not tell her what to think. A piece of writing she had done for school that she said she wanted a second opinion on but that she actually wanted, Reth understood, to share with someone who would take it seriously. He took it seriously. He read it carefully. He responded to what was actually in it rather than what she had intended to be in it, which was what she needed and was not what most people offered her. She received his responses with the specific attention of someone who had learned to be skeptical of praise and was therefore surprised by genuine engagement. On the 3rd visit she said, before she left, "You are the only person who reads things the way they are instead of the way you want them to be." Reth said, "That is the most accurate description of good reading I have encountered." Chisholm said, "I know. I thought of it myself." She left. He sat in the small room that had been given to him 11 months ago by a family who had put a plant on the windowsill and had never once made him feel like a guest, and thought about the fact that he had stopped being a researcher living with a family sometime around the 4th month and had never formally acknowledged this to himself until now. He was not a researcher living with a family. He was not certain he had a precise word for what he was. He thought that the word might be something like, someone this house includes. He thought that Marcus had said exactly that on the last night. He did not yet know Marcus would say it. He would not know until the last night arrived. But sitting in his room in the 9th month with the sounds of the house around him and the small plant on his windowsill that had been placed there by someone who wanted him to have something living in his space, he understood that whatever the word was, it was true. This house included him. He did not know when it had happened. He knew it had. The last night arrived in September. Exactly 1 year after his first evening at the Okafor door. Adiz had been cooking since the morning. Not one of the regular Sunday soups. Something larger. Something that required multiple stages and the full attention of most of the day. The kitchen had been producing smells since before Reth was awake, and they had deepened and layered throughout the day into something that was not just food. It was the smell of an occasion being made. The table was set in the specific way of events the family wanted to mark without making formal. Not the everyday arrangement. The tablecloth that came out approximately 4 times a year. Candles found in a drawer after some searching. The good plates, which Emeka was reminded twice to be careful with and which he handled with the exaggerated care of someone who had been reminded twice. Marcus was having a good week. Reth had learned to receive this as the genuine gift it was. Without burdening it with hope about subsequent weeks. Without trying to make it mean more than it was. A good week was complete in itself. It was enough. Marcus at the table with his full energy and his reading glasses on his forehead and his particular way of making every meal feel like something worth being at. That was enough. They ate for a long time. The conversation moved the way Okafor conversations always moved. Fast and overlapping and entirely without the structured progression that diplomatic meals required. Emeka talked about school. Chisholm talked about a book. Marcus asked Reth 3 questions about Sorvathi political history that he had apparently been saving for an appropriate occasion and had decided tonight was it. Adiz observed all of this with the specific pleasure of someone who had made the thing that was happening and was content to watch it happen. After dinner Emeka disappeared upstairs. He had been planning this for some time. Reth understood this later. The disappearance was not spontaneous. Emeka had known what he was going to do and had been waiting for the right moment and had decided the right moment was after dinner on the last night when everyone was still at the table. Adiz called up after 10 minutes to ask if he was all right. Emeka called back that he was busy. She called up again after another 5 minutes. He called back that he was almost done. The table waited. Marcus refilled drinks. Chisholm looked at her phone and then put it away in the deliberate way of someone deciding that tonight it could wait. Adiz looked at the door to the stairs with the expression of a mother who knows her child is doing something that matters to him and is giving him the space to finish it. Emeka came back down the stairs carefully. Both hands. Moving slowly. The posture of someone carrying something fragile across a distance they did not want to rush. He came to the table. He came to where Reth was sitting. He held out what he was carrying and waited for Reth to take it. Reth took it. It was made of paper. Multiple pieces of paper folded and shaped and connected with adhesive in a construction that had clearly taken a significant amount of time and thought and effort. It was not structurally stable. The adhesive was visible at the joints. The folds were not all even. It had been colored with what appeared to be every marker available in the Okafor household, applied with the enthusiastic imprecision of someone whose investment in the effort was complete and whose investment in technical perfection was secondary. It was the shape of a house. A small house. With a door and windows and a section at the back that was the garden and a corner of the garden that was the tomato plant, rendered in green marker with a care that was distinct from the rest of the coloring, as though this part required more precision than the others. And at the top, the highest point of the paper structure, a small square room. Emeka said, "It is our house." This is the kitchen and this is the sitting room and this is the backyard and the tomato plant is in the corner there. I used green for the plant because it is still growing. I put your room at the top because it is upstairs." Reth looked at the object in his hands. It was the least structurally sound thing he had ever been given. It was made of paper and adhesive and marker and one full evening of a 7-year-old's complete attention. He said, "Thank you, Emeka." His voice was steady. He had been a diplomat for 30 years. His voice was always steady. Emeka said, "You can take it with you. So you remember where you lived." Reth said, "I will not forget where I lived." Emeka said, "I know. But you can take it anyway." He said it with the complete simplicity of someone offering a thing because it was the right thing to offer. Not because it was needed. Because it was right. Reth held the paper house. Marcus said, "Reth." He stopped. He was quiet for a moment. The specific quiet of someone who had something true to say and was organizing the words to say it correctly. He said, "This year has been the hardest year of my life." A pause. He said, "It has also been one of the best." Not despite what happened. Not on one side of what happened. The same year. Both things true at the same time. He looked at Reth directly. He said, "Part of what made it one of the best was having you here. Not because you helped, though you did. Not because of anything practical. Because you were here. Because at some point this year you stopped being someone we were hosting and became someone this house includes." He paused. He said, "I want you to know that this house includes you. That is not a polite thing I am saying because tonight is the last night. That is true. And it does not stop being true when you leave." The kitchen was quiet. Reth sat at the table with the paper house in his hands and the words Marcus had just said in the room around him and the family he had come to document and had instead been claimed by, all of them present, all of them real, all of them looking at him with the specific warmth of people who meant what had just been said. He was a diplomat of 30 years. He had navigated consequential moments across 6 civilizations. He had developed language for most of the difficult things. He did not currently have access to any of that. He said, "I did not expect this year to change me." Marcus said, "Did it?" Reth said, "Yes." Marcus said, "Good." Adiz reached across the table. She placed her hand over Retha's hand. She left it there for a moment. Then she removed it. It was the most precisely calibrated gesture of warmth he had encountered in 30 years of diplomatic work. Not too much. Not too little. Exactly what the moment required and nothing beyond it. Chisholm had been quiet through most of this. She said, without looking up from the table, "You can come back. That is allowed." Reth said, "I know." Chisholm said, "Good. Because Emeka is already planning next year's garden. He is going to need someone to tell him his expectations are reasonable when they are not." Emeka said, "My expectations are always reasonable." Chisholm said, "They are enthusiastic." Emeka said, "That is the same thing." Marcus said, "It is not the same thing." Emeka said, "Ambassador Vaughan can help with the garden next time." Reth said, "I would like that." He meant it. He knew he meant it in the specific way that mattered. Without qualification. Without the diplomatic construction that had shaped his language for 30 years. Without strategy or calculation or professional distance. He meant it the way Emeka meant things. Completely. Without reserve. Without checking first whether it was appropriate to mean it this much. He held the paper house. Outside, through the kitchen window, the September evening was doing what September evenings did in this part of the world. Warm and darkening. The last of the summer making its exit without drama. Inside, the kitchen was full. It had been full since the first evening. It would be full after he left. That was the nature of a house that had been built this way. It did not empty when someone left it. It held what had happened in it. It held the people who had sat at this table. It held every ordinary evening and every 2 in the morning and every tomato checked in the rain. Reth understood that he would carry this house with him. Not the paper version in his hands, though he would carry that too. The real one. The full one. The one that had claimed him without asking permission across 12 months of ordinary life. He would carry it the way you carry the things that have changed you. Not as a memory you access deliberately. As a part of how you see everything after. Reth returned to Sorvathi Diplomatic Corps headquarters 14 days after his last evening at the Okafor table. He spent those 14 days writing his final report. This was longer than the time he usually required. His previous final reports had taken 3 days at most. The delay was not due to volume. The delay was due to the particular difficulty of producing a document that was simultaneously honest and within the established framework of Corps reporting. He discovered, partway through the first draft, that the two requirements were not fully compatible. An honest report of his year with the Okafor family could not be contained within the standard Corps categories. The standard categories had been designed for external observation. They describe behavior and pattern and measurable outcome. They were excellent instruments for what they were designed for. They were not designed for what this year had required and produced. He wrote the report he would have written a year ago. He reviewed it. He recognized it as accurate and insufficient. He deleted it. He wrote the report he wanted to write. He reviewed it. He recognized it as honest and unprofessional in the technical sense of falling outside the established framework. He revised it. He spent 14 days finding the version that was both. What he produced was unlike any document the Corps had received in its 400-year history. This was not because it was unprofessional. It met every technical requirement of a Corps final report. The formatting was correct. The structure was standard. Every required section was present and complete. But within that structure it contained something that Corps reports had never previously contained. Something the review committee read 3 times before determining it was not an error and twice more before determining it was intentional and once more after that while determining what to do about it. The conclusion section read, "The function of human family structure cannot be adequately understood through external observation. The structure is not visible from the outside because it was not built for external visibility. It was built for interior habitation. Its properties are accessible only to a mind that inhabits it. This posting has demonstrated that a Sorvathi diplomatic mind can inhabit it. This requires time. It requires willingness. It requires the specific discipline of setting aside the observer position and accepting the participant position without treating this as a methodological compromise. It is not a compromise. It is the method. The observer position is the compromise." The review committee debated this paragraph for 2 weeks. The recommendation section contained one recommendation. Singular. Unambiguous. It read, "Expand the immersion program to include every senior Sorvathi diplomat. Minimum posting duration 1 year. Host family selected for ordinariness rather than diplomatic profile or strategic value. The selection criterion should be families who live their lives without awareness of being observed. Because ordinariness is where the finding lives. Extraordinary circumstances do not reveal what families are. Ordinary ones do." The review committee debated the recommendation for 9 weeks. The debate was not about whether the findings were accurate. No one on the committee questioned the accuracy. The debate was about whether the methodology that had produced them was one the Corps was prepared to institutionalize. Whether the Corps was prepared to send its senior diplomats into ordinary homes for a year and allow those homes to do to them what the Okafor home had done to Reth Vaun. Whether that was an appropriate thing to do to a diplomat. Whether it was an appropriate thing to do to the families. The debate was genuinely difficult. 3 years later, the program was expanded exactly as Reth had recommended. The expansion memo was 2 pages. It cited Reth's report as the primary justification. It quoted the conclusion section in full, including the final sentence about the observer position being the compromise. It described the expected outcomes in careful diplomatic language that communicated very little of what those outcomes would actually involve. The diplomats who read the memo and accepted the postings discovered what the language had not conveyed. So did the families who received them. Reth was posted to a research station in the outer registry when the expansion memo was distributed. He did not read it until 3 days after its release. He was occupied with the current posting. A standard assignment. Interspecies research coordination. Precise work. Important work. Work that suited his capabilities and that he performed with the professional attention his career had always produced. His office was small. A desk. A terminal. Reference materials organized into the system he had developed over 30 years of postings. Everything in its place. Everything accessible. Nothing unnecessary. On the desk, beside the terminal, was one object that did not belong to the category of professional materials. It was made of paper. Multiple pieces folded and shaped and connected with adhesive, colored with every marker available in the Okafor household, colored with the enthusiastic imprecision of a 7-year-old who had spent a full evening making something for someone he wanted to remember where they had lived. It was not structurally sound. It had required repairs on 2 occasions during transit and storage. Small ones. A joint that had separated. A fold that had flattened. Reth had repaired it each time with the specific care of someone repairing something that could not be replaced. It served no professional function. It occupied space on a working desk that had limited space available. It remained. Colleagues who visited his office sometimes noticed it. They looked at it the way people look at things that are clearly personal in a professional context. With curiosity and with the particular restraint of people who understand that some things are not for asking about. Some of them asked anyway. They said, "What is that?" Reth said, "A house." They said, "Whose house?" He said, "Mine." He said it without qualification. Without the diplomatic softening that would have turned it into something more comfortable and less true. Without explanation or context or the additional sentences that would have made the answer easier to receive but would have also made it smaller than it was. Mine. One word. 30 years of diplomatic precision in the service of one accurate word. The house was his, the way things become yours when they have changed you. Not because you built them. Not because you own them. Because they have left something in you that was not there before and that you carry forward into everything after, and that does not diminish with distance or time. He had arrived at the Okafor home with a travel case and a research journal and 29 years of methodology that had always been sufficient. He had left with 1 year of ordinary life inside him that no methodology could have produced. And on his desk in a small office in the outer registry, a paper house sat beside a terminal and was the most important object in the room. Not because of what it was made of. Because of what had made it. Because of an 8-year-old who had carried it carefully with both hands across a kitchen to the person he wanted to remember where they had lived. Because of a family that had not hosted a diplomat for a year. That had simply lived their life. And let him live it with them.